Good evening, friends. It is a great pleasure to see so many of you here. The risen Christ said, "Behold, I make all things new." And we are to hear this evening about ecumenism new style. Reflection on the situation of the churches in the 21st century. I first became closely involved in ecumenism about the time of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. And at that time, there was an atmosphere of spring, of renewal, of fresh hope. In the decades that have followed, perhaps that hope has somewhat faded. And in some ways, the movement towards Christian unity has grown a little tired. So tonight, perhaps, we shall hear how it may be renewed and reinvigorated. It is a great honor for the Friends of Mount Athos that we have this evening the Bishop of London. Tomorrow, as you will be aware, is the feast of St. John Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople. And I've always thought that Bishop Charters is a bishop in the true patristic spirit. What St. John Chrysostom bore witness to in his day, you have borne witness to in our own time. I've always found your messages that I have listened to, that they possess a patristic inspiration. And so it is with great eagerness that I look forward to hearing you tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. Your Eminences, Dr. Speak, old friend, and friends, thank you very much indeed. It's good to be among friends this evening. And thank you for that introduction, beloved brother. I only hope that my end is not quite the same as that of the Archbishop of Constantinople. But nevertheless, it was an end that showed enormous courage and Christian fortitude. I had the very great privilege of entertaining Metropolitan Ignatius of Volos to lunch, and he's here to give a lecture at the London School of Economics, and I'm sorry about that because we all ought probably to be there. It's a very significant event, and it is a very hopeful sign. It was only a very short time ago that such a lecture by such a distinguished metropolitan would have been unthinkable in the London School of Economics. I can remember the time when I was in a corridor of the London School of Economics and the director approached us. I won't be specific about which director. And when he saw us hoving down on him, he turned his face to the wall rather than greet us. Such was the level of prejudice that existed in those days. But of course, one of the hopeful things is that the LSE, as a thoroughly contemporary institution, sees that at the very heart of an institution of higher education in the 21st century, there has to be an interfaith centre. And the chaplain of the LSE, Jim Walters, has been allowed to play a really creative and prominent part in bringing to birth something that the school has financed itself and installed right at the heart of its buildings. Now, this is a very extraordinary change in a comparatively short time, and it is a very hopeful sign. But not everything the Metropolitan said was hopeful. And I think that in some of his remarks, he echoed the comments which have just been made by Metropolitan Kallistos. He is at work, he is part of the group that is examining documents that will be put before the Council in Constantinople in 2016, and these concern ecumenical relations, and he echoed what Metropolitan Kallistos said in reflecting on how the ecumenical situation had deteriorated since he was first really active in it in the 1980s. And at the same time, he reflected very sadly on the fact that Europe, where the divisions between East and West looked as if they were going to be softened and obliterated after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that there is a new reality to a division between East and West. No longer is it a matter of the Cold War and communism, but there is, he thinks, a cultural and economic divide which is every bit as much threatening to the peace and security of Europe, as well as all sorts of other challenges that we face. So that's the kind of world in which we're all living at the moment. We meet at a time of remembrance, of course, and welcome, by the way, to this parish, which is particularly devoted to relations with the media, which is obviously a very important part of our story this evening, the newspaper industry. There is an altar in St. Bride's, Fleet Street, as many of you know, dedicated to journalists who have given their lives in the service of their profession. We had a great Eucharist there last Wednesday to recall those who have died over the past 12 months, and there have been far too many of them. But this is a season of remembrance, and although we cannot change the past, one of the most creative things in which we are all involved is the responsibility of how to remember it. We cannot change the past, but we are responsible for how we remember it. And of course, as we all know, the act of remembrance is profoundly creative. As Christians, we believe it's not simply taking a file down from a shelf to recall an event long ago and far away. It's a work of recreation. We remember Jesus Christ as the icon of God. We remember him in the Eucharist as opposed to dismembering him. It's a very vigorous word, which unfortunately has come down in the world in English and tends to only mean, I remember last year's holiday in Frinton or something like that. Remember in the Eucharist is extraordinarily strong. It is remembering him as opposed to dismembering him. It is the act by which he creates us as a new body and members of one another. And so relations between the various parts of the Christian church is an exercise in right remembering. Now, I'm addressing friends as one of the friends, and I think that one of the things in the sort of world which Metropolitan Kallistos referred to that is extraordinarily important is strengthening the bonds of friendship, repairing our friendships, exposing ourselves in encounter personally, because that is what provides the dynamic. And particularly as we look together in the same direction at the common challenges of faith, the Christian faith in this 21st century world, that is what is giving us energy. And I just want to tell you about a recent visit that I've made, which has made a very great impression on me. And it's the reason why I'm wearing this encolpion. In the 1990s, I went to Kosovo in the wake of the conflict there to make contact with the surviving communities in the Serbian monasteries in Kosovo. And I was in Peć on a particularly desperate night. It was in many ways a medieval scene. The monastery was ruined, It was surrounded by tanks, Italian tanks, to protect it. The rain was falling, the dark was very intense, and there was a woman in the monastic enclosure wailing all night because she had just watched her daughter tortured and then killed by the UCK. It was a scene of medieval horror. And a young Serbian monk approached me and said, "Do you happen to know Catherine Pickstock?" Now, it was a sort of Casablanca experience of all the times and all the places you would not expect to be asked about what a marvellous, a brilliant Lady Cambridge theologian, but perhaps one of the most complex theologians writing in English at the time. And she just produced this great book of hers called After Writing the Liturgical Consummation of Philosophy. Now, it has certain complexities. And poor old Jovan, because the monk's name proved to be Jovan, said, "I've just been asked to translate this into Serbian, and I'm finding it rather difficult." And so we spent the entire night looking at some really very complex passages. And of course, one of Catherine's great points is we must not make the scriptures in particular too accessible. It's important to defamiliarize yourself with them if you're actually to encounter the voice of wisdom behind the text. So we spent the night together and parted. And it was only 3 months ago that a letter arrived from Jovan saying, "I've always thought about that night, I've remembered it, and I would like you to come because I am now to be a bishop of a re-established diocese of the Serbian Church in Pakrac, which is in northeastern Croatia. It is the ancient diocese of Slavonia, and that was the place, of course, from which Serbs were ethnically cleansed in the early 1990s. And indeed, the bishop's residence in Pakrac is without a roof, it's pockmarked with shell fire, and there are very few Serbs, used to be in a majority in that part of northeastern Croatia. There are very few Serbs left. And this is a very courageous thing. After a gap, he has been asked by the Patriarch of Serbia to resume Orthodox church life in these very desperate and difficult circumstances. And so he said, "Will you come?" And it seemed that there was so much of providence in that I felt I had to. And it was a very great privilege to be there. And a great privilege to be there also because it is extraordinarily close to the Jasenovac concentration camp, where hundreds of thousands perished in the course of the Second World War at the hands of fascist forces. There was even a camp for children. The children who were old enough to understand that they were Serbs shared the fate of their elders, and the ones that weren't old enough were adopted and brought up as a different race. And walking over the field, which is covered with the most unutterably banal communist symbolism, some meaningless concrete flower and little hummocks, one realized how important it was for one's prayers and one's ecumenical energy to expose oneself and to remember once again how so many of our fellow believers all the way through the world are suffering for their faith at the moment, that this is a living experience for many parts of our body, and not an experience, of course, confined to the Orthodox. It is also something which is familiar to Anglican Christians in Pakistan, where a whole church was incinerated and many martyrs were created. It's extraordinarily important, I think, the witness of the martyrs, if we are to recover, as Metropolitan Callistos says, a real energy for Christian unity in a world of enormous challenge. And of course we are faced with a 21st century in which, as I shall say later, a religion is more salient for good and for ill than it was in the 20th century. But then, of course, the visit to Pakratz and the memories of Pech also illustrate how profoundly connected so many parts of the Christian church are with a sense of national identity. And as we enter a century in which there are global challenges, in which the human race, not only the Christian church, is faced with challenge that need cooperation and unity between us, it is one of the great conundrums of the Christian faith. God so loved the world that he was generous, he loved the whole world. He came in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ, who is his human face. Jesus Christ is God's plan for the spiritual evolution of the whole human race. And yet somehow this extraordinary faith has become very much associated with compartmentalized national identities. And that is something which is an enormous challenge. But the neglect of friendships, I had to face, going to Serbia, that was a church with which the Church of England had particularly close relationships in the interwar period. It was actually Nikolai Velimirovich, who's recently, I think I'm right in saying, been canonized, who was the very first non-Anglican to preach in St. Paul's Cathedral immediately after the First World War. He was the very first. And it was a peculiarly close relationship with the church in Serbia, and there was even a group called the Britansky Group. Unfortunately, the Britansky Group was immediately rounded up by the Germans after they invaded and liquidated. And it seems to me that it's extraordinarily important to bind up the threads of memory, to honor our friendships, to be indefatigable in rehearsing stories which are edifying and help us to face together the challenges of this new century. Nationalism and parts of the Christian church, certainly that is something which unites as a problem East and West. I think reflecting on the period of the 16th century, which was, of course, extraordinarily formative in terms of churches in the West, there is an ecumenical agenda for repentance which embraces at least three themes. There was the over-definition of mystery in the interests of polemics. This happened right the way through the church. There was a bureaucratizing of the church. There was a multiplication of regulation in the church, actually in the West, before the state. And then finally, there was an over-identification of parts of the church with nation-states and with dynasties. And this was very dangerous because, of course, it was happening in the age of the cartographer, the maps, drawing lines, defining territories, and the church was complicit with many of the regimes which sought to absolutize themselves at the time. And in the history of the West, what has happened is that where there's been too close a relationship between the church and the governing regime, the result has been a very large, often left-wing, often semi-atheist political movement. And it is an extraordinarily important matter for the 21st century. And I was very fascinated to hear that this is the theme of the next conference being held by the Volos Academy in Greece. what should be the proper relationship of the Christian church to the government, the state, wherever we happen to operate. The ecumenical movement. Let me share another memory. I was in hospitable Romania, and how I enjoyed it, because our hosts were extraordinarily attentive and generous. I was in Sibiu in 2007 for the third Christian Ecumenical European Assembly. And that brought together Orthodox churches of the Reformation in quite a contested part of the world. Transylvania, which had been one of the principal centres of the Reformation, was for many, many centuries part of the Kingdom of Hungary, was called Hermannstadt when its population largely spoke German, is now called Sibiu, is firmly within the borders of Romania. And this great assembly brought together in 2007 all those who, like myself, had been working hard in ecumenism over the past 20 years. Most of us were follically challenged, late middle-aged, sagging Caucasians, exactly like myself. It was a terrifying spectacle in some ways. These are good-hearted people with ideals, but very few under 30, no black faces. I brought one in my delegation, Timi Dorgu, who's a 19-year-old Nigerian. His address to the assembly was electrifying because he was the only person of that age who spoke. And he was the only person who stood for one of the great facts of Christianity in contemporary Europe, and that is some of its most dynamic expressions are in the black-led churches. It was a vision of ecumenism which had actually become the province of specialists. And when ecumenical organizations and committees speak to one another, on the whole, we are no longer entering the bloodstream and the DNA of the praying, worshipping church. This is not to underestimate the dedication and the zeal of the people involved, but it is a tragic fact that if ecumenism becomes a speciality, then it becomes a dead letterbox. It drifts out of sight. And certainly the Third European Christian Assembly in Sibiu was something of an icon of that, and it was also a place where you could hear that the very word ecumenism was in some quarters suspect, and it was regarded as a watering down of faith, not a response to where we find ourselves as a Christian church in the 20th, 21st century. Now, Timi Dorgu's appearance was very significant because one of the things we have to face in the 21st century is a dramatic change in the sociology of world Christianity. Just take one example of what I mean. This is the Pentecostal wave, which is shaping countries and transforming the sociology of the Christian church throughout the world. The case of Brazil. The number of Brazilians identifying themselves as Pentecostals, evangelicals, has doubled in the last 20 years. It's now well over 20% of that huge country. There is an evangelical caucus in Parliament after the recent elections, which has 63 members of the House of Representatives. It's a major party, 3 senators, and that's an underestimate because the only people who are counted are those with formal links with Pentecostal churches. There are more in sympathy, but that is the core of this caucus. And there is a great challenge to all mainstream established churches in the cultural changes which lie behind this great shift in the sociology of the Christian church worldwide. I remember Patriarch Daniel, when he was part of the liaison group between the Conference of European Churches and the Roman Catholic Church, saying that in the face of these changes, orthodoxy was profoundly challenged, and the phrase he used, we could dwindle, he said, to being an exotic Eastern sect. And what are these changes? Well, there is a great cultural change to established authority. There is an anti-hierarchical trend. People are insisting on horizontal relationships, not hierarchical ones. This presents very considerable problems for the Bishop of London. I hope that such, and you were very kind, I mean, I passionately believe that I believe and preach the same faith as St. John Chrysostom, but the style which one has to use to communicate, of course, changes from place to place. And in my diocese, which is an ecumenical movement in itself, we have churches which are so high that the cardinal said to me of one of them, it makes my cathedral look like a Wesleyan preaching shop, and churches that are so informal that in the morning I appear in a 2-foot-tall mitre encrusted with gems, with gloves, that's what I do in the morning, and in the evening, as I put on my Episcopal Scarlet Court hipsters and attempt to engage with, mind you, I don't go the whole hog. When I was addressing 5,000 charismatics in the Royal Albert Hall, they very kindly asked me to introduce this great meeting. And as soon as I got off the stage, some very kind lady in the administration came up with a plate and a pair of earplugs because they know I hate the music so much. So there is a great challenge to the way in which we speak, the way in which we communicate. There is the disintermediating effect of the new information order, the way in which this is such a commonplace point. I won't labour it, and particularly not in these circumstances, because this is what St. Bride's is all about. Churches are more accessible to one another in a quite unparalleled way in history, but also misinformation spreads rapidly. And in the new information order, if you're selling anything, you hype, you dramatise, you privilege extreme voices. If you're doing your job, if you're a friend, like the Friends of Mount Athos, well, you're edited out because you're not sufficiently interesting. It's only if there's absurdity or a row that you hear about it, and that prejudices our view of one another. I am, of course, in this matter of communication still very much a part of the old world. I was in a primary school the other day, and one of the children said, can you remember anything when you were at school? And I said, well, I was the ink monitor. And they looked very baffled. And I had this can, because I was extraordinarily responsible young boy even then, so much so that my parents had to rebel against me because, but I had the ink monitor's job, you see, and I had to go around filling up these china inkwells, and we used to learn to write by our, dipping in the steel nibs and then starting on the copper plate. They looked totally baffled. Fortunately, the teacher came to my rescue and said, oh yes, she said, we've just done a project on Victorian England, and there's one of those over there. So as you can see, I'm not anyone to lecture you on the new information order, but I have to note that it has brought very considerable strains and challenges to the whole church. Folk churches in Europe, and this is a challenge that is, according to Metropolitan Ignatius, being faced in Greece. Folk churches are dissolving under the impact of consumerism, which of course is much more dangerous to Christianity than communism. Consumerism is a vastly greater threat to Christianity than communism. So there are some of the challenges of the 21st century. And yet the signs are that this century is seeing the return of religious convictions and institutions with a new salience in national and international affairs outside Europe and outside elite America. Very interesting lecture recently given by the former Director General of the BBC, Mark Thompson. He said that when he began in the media, the commentariat, his colleagues were all convinced that the story of God would have one end: relegation to the leisure sector, the harmless pursuit of those with antiquarian interests, those whose highs came from sniffing the odour of gently decomposing hassocks. That this would be the end of the story. And everybody knew that was going to be the case. And parts of the church actually internalized that story. They accepted it. And so much so that the secular commentators were convinced that we'd reached, without the benefit of God, the consummation of human history. 1992, Francis Fukuyama published that great book, The End of History. With the advent of market economics and liberal democracy, the human project had reached its pinnacle, and no more progress could be expected. I mean, we'd have to mop up areas of darkness throughout the world, of course, but it generally meant that history had come to its triumphant conclusion. In the year 2000, in the year of the millennium of our Lord Jesus Christ, The Economist, that widely respected international journal, published at Christmas time an obituary of God. And in 2009, the new editor of The Economist, John Micklethwaite, co-authored a book entitled God is Back. And if the editor of The Economist says so, you've got to take it seriously. And I think that it does, it's just a little symbol of the extraordinary transformation of the scene. God is back for good or ill, of course not the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, but religion, which is so often, the danger of religion is always this: the bruised and humiliated ego surreptitiously reascending to worship a God made in its own image. That is always the temptation. This is why the Old Testament prophets continually inveigh against idolatry, making a God in your own image. This is always a threat, and we see it in the contemporary world. And it is devastatingly attractive. I hear all sorts of people talking about ISIL and IS. Of course, it's a terrible distortion of it, essentially. I mean, how politicians actually overnight become theological experts and manage to, make these great generalizations about matters they really know very little about is very remarkable. But one of the things in London, IS is devastatingly attractive. It is, of course, one of the aspects of one of the greatest challenges that faces the modern world: what to do with the virility of millions and millions of unemployed young men. And particularly if you look at the demographic profiles in North Africa, in Egypt, in the Middle East, you've got an enormous number of energetic young men looking for shape, meaning, direction in their lives. And make no mistake about it, what is on offer in terms of ISIL is dangerously attractive. So what in this context of reviving salience, but a religious culture which is full of darkness and ambiguity, and some of the particular challenges facing churches which we represent here, what are relations between the Eastern and Western churches as we reflect on that remark of Metropolitan Ignatius that he fears a new divide? I want to just think about our relations alongside some of the contemporary pressures I've been trying to describe. I owe my own introduction to orthodoxy and my love of the Orthodox Church to Sir Stephen Runciman. I expect he was important for you as well, Graham, wasn't he? Yeah, great. Stephen, and we'd all want to pay tribute to the part he has played in opening up the Byzantine world for students of history like myself at a time when history was really very Hokkaido-centric. And I see Stephen now in my mind's eye as he was in the early 60s after a college feast, holding a knot of undergraduates, of whom I was one, entranced with his reminiscences. And Stephen, I always remember him saying, well, he said, I was visiting a sabbat in Northern Ireland with Dame Margaret Murray, and he always used to speak with his eyes half closed when he was launched on a narration. Yes, I was visiting a sabbat in Northern Ireland with Dame Margaret Murray, and as we came out, she said to me, Stephen, you know, goats aren't what they were in my young day. It's a fairly devastating reminiscence, I must say. We all stood around absolutely astonished. But he also taught a whole generation to see Byzantium with new eyes. He was revered in Greece, as you know, on Athos itself, as a friend and champion, and one of his last acts was to secure the restoration of one of the monastic buildings on the Holy Mountain. So who's playing his part now? I asked myself. William Dalrymple, of course, members of this association. But I'm searching very hard for young people, young priests, so that the baton can be passed on, because I do see that there is a distance, a fraying at that level, and that people perhaps aren't having the encounters that have been so important in my own spiritual pilgrimage so long ago. And of course, as far as the Church of England is concerned, there is a very special affinity with the Orthodox tradition. After all, in the 7th century, the Archbishop to whom we owe so much in the Church of England was, of course, a Greek. He was Theodore, a Greek of Tarsus, consecrated by the Pope as Archbishop of Canterbury in 668. Now, it's very good to remember for somebody like myself that he was already past pensionable age when this happened. And this is a matter for rejoicing. Somebody like me, who's now far too old to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, but fortunately still too young to be the Pope, it's an enormous encouragement and inspiration. And having been consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury, for the next 22 years, he was, Theodore, head of the English Church, extending the episcopate, bringing about greater doctrinal unity. And so we begin together in the undivided church, a state to which devoutly I hope we shall return. Of course, we all know the subsequent story of the medieval estrangement. Stephen Runciman has helped to clear our vision about the rights and wrongs of that conflict, and particularly of the Fourth Crusade. Wise words written by Bishop Callistos, as he was then, who said, what shocked the Greeks more than anything else was the wanton and systematic sacrilege of the Crusaders. And as the Byzantines watched the Crusaders tear to pieces the altar and the icon screen in the Church of the Holy Wisdom and set prostitutes on the Patriarch's throne, they must have felt that those who did such things were not Christians in the same sense as themselves. Very judiciously put, and very moderately put as well. Now, this of course, is a story which we, particularly in the West, ought to remember with shame. But in England, in the 16th century, there was a re-engagement with the churches and the spiritual traditions of the East. And in the preface to the first book of Common Prayer, Cranmer appeals to the authority of the ancient fathers to establish the mind of the church. He says that quite specifically. The prayer book appeal to patristic authority has continued to be characteristic of Anglicanism. The title page of Bishop Jewell's challenge sermon, by the way, a classic statement of doctrine, preached at St. Paul's Cross just 10 years after the publication of the first prayer book. It bears, that title page, a clause from the 6th canon of the Council of Nicaea, let the ancient customs prevail or be maintained. And it is this memory, this tradition, which I have been labouring to make sure has not been forgotten in our own age. And the recovery and the strengthening of that tradition were among the considerations which led me to found St. Mellitus College, our new embryo Christian university. And one of the most thrilling developments there, one of the things that gives me great hope, is the way in which young charismatics in particular are re-engaging with patristic topics and taking doctoral studies in major patristic doctrinal areas. It's a very important pointer to the future, and a rather hopeful one, of the church, because the St. Mellitus College is now the largest theological college in the country. It's based in this diocese in West London. It has 186 young people in training for the priesthood, so it's not insignificant that there is a quite specific influence, particularly, I have to say, of Evagrius Ponticus, his teaching about theology flowing from prayer. The person who prays truly is a theologian, has been formative and very influential in the foundation of a college which partly arose from our frustration with the fact that academic theology now is often taught by people who are very unconnected with the community of faith and prayer. So it's very good to compose litanies rehearsing the story of the ties between our churches, and it's extraordinarily important we should do so in this period which I think is seeing an eclipse of memories. In the ecumenical movement, of course, both Anglican and Orthodox churches were prominent, and this is perhaps the world to which I belong, the establishment of the World Council after World War II, but with the diminution of Britain's role as a world power, a great investment of energy on the part of the leadership of the Church of England in building up relations with and the institutions of the Anglican Communion, relations with the Orthodox perhaps didn't enjoy the same priority as they had in the interwar period. But there have been notable initiatives, and one of those Metropolitan Callistos himself is still involved in, the Anglican Orthodox joint doctrinal discussions established after Michael Ramsey's visit to Athenagoras in 1962. Michael Ramsey, of course, did look the patriarchal part, and indeed at one point I was a fascinated visitor year after year to the Museum of Atheism in St. Petersburg. It was in the Church of Our Lady of Kazan, and there was a mocking tableau headed "Some Foreign Friends of the Orthodox Church." And there was Michael Ramsey with his Canterbury cap at a crazy angle, and he'd obviously seized the primatial cross from a chaplain, and it appeared that he was going to wade into the crowd, scything left and right. And so this photograph was put up as part of the exhibition in the Museum of Atheism, and it was very amusing to see how the atheists began to lose faith in their lack of faith. And the years went by, and it all became much more sort of, understanding and academic. A lot was said about Voltaire, until the municipality in St. Petersburg removed the grant. The Museum of Atheism had to close, and what happened was the remains of St. Seraphim of Sarov were found in the crypt in shoeboxes, and he rose from the crypt to the Museum of Atheism, and these things are a great parable and a fantastic encouragement. So there are good things. Far from being a matter of contention, icons, Orthodox traditions of prayer have come to enrich Anglican worship, both in private and public. The welcome presence of the Archbishop of Thyatira last Sunday at the cenotaph. I mean, he's not an exotic foreign figure. He represents the ecumenical patriarch, but he is an important Christian witness in the heart of our country. It would be unwise, however, to be too self-congratulatory. strains have entered the relationship, notably after the ordination of women. Orthodox have come to realize that there are great debates going on inside the Church of England. One of the most vivid experiences of the reality of these debates was on a visit by Bishop Runcie, as he was then, to Bishop Joseph of Râmnicu Vâlcea in Romania. They had very generous welcome and entertainment, and on that occasion, Bishop Runcie was accompanied by his wife, and the couple had a typically lively debate at the dinner table, and Bishop Joseph looked bewilderedly from one to the other and simply said, wonderingly, "Dominus dixit, et domina contradixit." But one of the most heartening aspects of relations at present is the theological partnership that already exists as Anglicans and Orthodox together confront a postmodern sensibility which is prepared to admit the appeal of ancient liturgy and art, but which combines such aesthetic appreciation with a relativistic despair about the possibility of any truth claims not sanctioned by individual taste. And so we come back to Catherine Pickstock in some ways, because that is one of the areas which she touches upon. All churches are being called to reinterpret their story in a world where there are no longer any emperors, where hierarchy is a suspect concept, and where there are attempts to reduce the mystery of the church to the level of an institution which caters for spiritual consumers, rather like a spiritual Tesco's. And we are partners in the gospel at a time which conforms to the pagan state described by Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. You remember that Gibbon said that paganism was a condition in which the people regarded all religions as equally true. The philosophers regarded all religions as equally false, and the magistrate regarded all religions as equally useful. It seems to me that that description of ancient Rome is not so far from where we find ourselves. As partners, as friends, we perhaps have the potential to make a modest contribution to building the unity of our world and its peace by reinvigorating the synapses between the two hemispheres of the mind and memory of the Christian Church. And I also believe we have the resources and the responsibility to encourage one another in faithfulness in this beguiling pagan environment. Because as we look together at this horizon, at this context, I think that itself produces huge energy for a re-engagement. Now is the time to renew and rebuild friendships as we confront these challenges. And I would say one really good example is the work done by Patriarch Bartholomew in establishing his Symposium for Religion, Science and the Environment, which spans not only Christian confessional boundaries in the face of the ecological challenges which confront us all, but also introduces working scientists in the field to representatives of all the major world faiths. But my last point is this. It seems to me that the role of religious communities, and we are friends of Mount Athos, is particularly crucial. This is one of the present Archbishop of Canterbury's primary determinations. You know that he's established a new community of prayer built on the experience of the Chemin Neuf, one of those new communities which originated in France. And he has established this in Lambeth Palace. And of course, religious communities are places where a radically different way of Christian living can be experienced. And that, I believe, is particularly eloquent in the sick hurry and divided aims, which is the strange disease of modern life. The role of leadership in all this, which we all exercise, all friends, in our various ways, is to be clear-eyed about the challenges, not in denial about the change which has come over the world, but like the Cappadocians, We have to confront, not offering merely lamentation or the opiate of nostalgia, but we have to offer a roadmap to hope which uses elements of contemporary culture but is authentically Christian. God so loved the world that he was generous, and it is in remembering the icon of God, Jesus Christ, that our hope really lies. I think you've been astonishingly courteous, and I'm very grateful to have been given this opportunity for these few reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Richard. You have spoken to us with the eloquence of St. John Chrysostom. I'm encouraged by the thought that you are not yet old enough to become Pope, so this is something we may look forward to. You've mentioned some of the somber aspects of our present situation, but what you have given to us in your address has been a sense of hope. And without hope, we are not truly human. So we have a little time for questions. I would like to ask this question. In the reinterpretation that you see that all Christian communions undertaking, retelling their stories, do you think that the parish will continue to be important, or will the church find other structures to reach out now to a largely secularized world?
I think that's an extremely significant and important question. Curiously enough, one of the great mega-church leaders from the United States, Rick Warren, who was here for that leadership conference that I was describing, confessed, "I have spent," he said, "too much time on parachurch and not enough time on parish church." And it was an important admission, because although you can draw like people together, the role of a locally based parish, assembling people in a face-to-face way, to constitute the body of Christ across all the differences of class and age and the various things that divide us as human beings, that continues to be very important. And although Christian networks, ways of bringing people together, are very significant, and certainly we're exploring many of them, it is very often, it's on the basis of like attracting like. And it does seem to me that the parish is not that. It's the embrace of an enormous diversity which enriches us all. I was very glad to be a parish priest for 9 years in London, and one of the things I delighted to see was I had a judge in the congregation and also a very notable con artist who had been in jail many times for fraud. And the fact that they came to know one another as friends and swap notes. Where else in a compartmentalized city like ours could that happen but in the church? And it simply doesn't happen anywhere else. So I think that there is a continuing and vastly significant place for parish churches, however much we may draw people into the Paschal mystery by assembling like-minded groups. Nevertheless, that will never supersede the work of face-to-face local communities. And I think that becomes more important in the age when people are operating through screens. That's another point. Somebody came in the other day and said, "Father, I really need some advice because my 2-year-old has got iPad rage." His parent had attempted to confiscate, at the age of 2, had attempted to confiscate his iPad, and there was an explosion. Of course, we're seeing a new generation which is being brought up to communicate in a different way, and I think there are huge dangers there. So it seems to me that the role of face-to-face personal presence, human communities, is amplified, not diminished, as a reaction. But we have to make sure that we have colonized cyberspace as well. The church porch is now the website. It is not inside the door. I mean, you find when you talk to people in churches in London that more often than not that they've looked it up on the web. And we just have to be realistic about the fact that we must be present there as well. Or else, if we are not, the Christian voice in cyberspace is represented by shrill and judgmental people. You're quite right, you can't package it, and some forms of religion are trying to sell God, in fact, as a package in various ways. And silence and stillness are the great educators. You'll remember that St. Ignatius of Antioch said that a bishop never more resembles Jesus Christ than when he's got his mouth shut. And this is a very profound lesson for us all. But I don't think you... I remember being vastly amused with the concept that in our church there had to be a conference for hermits, that they were going to be brought together to discuss the various exigencies of the eremitic life. And you catch such things. You catch such things from authentic practitioners who overflow with joy and perhaps don't say anything at all, but it's immensely influential. What you say, I could not agree with more, and that is why, of course, we need both ressourcement, going back to our common roots, which is why I invoke Theodore of Tarsus, and we also need an eschatological sense. We need a sense of judgment on where we are at the moment. We need a sense that history is coming together in God's providence. And that very often releases the imprisonment that there is when the source of our unity tends not to be Jesus Christ, but some cultural artifact. And the distinction between those two is absolutely crucial. You've said something very important, it seems to me. I mean, the Holy Fathers talk about prayer of the mind in the heart, whereas, of course, when you're trying to teach Western people how to pray, it is extraordinarily difficult to get across the first hurdle, in which many people believe that prayer is really a species of thinking. It's a mental activity, and therefore they always stay at the ego mental level and never really get much further than that. And one of the most important works that's been written in the last 10 years is an astonishing, fruitful work which lights on just what you've said. And that is by a very remarkable man called Ian McGilchrist, who was both clinical director of the Maudsley, somebody who'd done profound researches in the science of the brain, but he'd also lectured in English literature in Oxford and been a prize fellow of All Souls. You probably know him, Father. Ian McGilchrist, who has written a most remarkable book called The Master and His Emissary, which is all about the impact on Western culture of a particular way of thinking, a particular bias in the way in which our brains, which of course are not hardwired. This is why prayer is so vital, because of course there is a potential for creating synapses and connections, which is often edited out because we choose to look very obsessively in a particular direction, and therefore we cannot see or hear with the spiritual eyes and the spiritual ears. The book, The Master and His Emissary, which is derived from a parable told by Nietzsche, is an extraordinarily profound and helpful exploration of this bias in culture, which is now, of course, expanding over the whole world. So I think that it has, and he specifically makes the connection with just what you've said, that the great tradition of Christian spirituality is prayer of the mind in the heart, and the spiritual heart, of course, being located not in the pump, which sends the blood round the system, but in the vitals of a human being. That's a very important observation. And I must say, I didn't know that we had Serbs in the audience, but I was deeply moved by the visit, and particularly I want to salute and speak well of him, Bishop Jovan of Slavonia, who is a very remarkable, energetic, courageous, thoughtful character. He's a person of great hope, I think, as a leader in the Orthodox tradition. I hope he's going to visit this country, and I hope that we shall be able to introduce him to some of the friends of Mount Athos. I'm glad you've made that emphasis. Of course, bishops early on acquire the fatal facility of continuous utterance, and it's necessary to restrict your remarks to a certain number of themes rather than spreading them too wide. But you're absolutely right. The mood music from Rome, rather than the actual changes, is more encouraging. I think also we all have to recognize, and of course there is an Orthodox Roman Catholic dialogue going on at the moment, in which Metropolitan John Zizioulas is a prominent participant. I think we have to recognize that no matter what our view on the dogmatic position of the Petrine office is, as a matter of fact, the successor of Peter is able to convene. He has an enormous convening power. He's able to convene the leaders of the world wisdom traditions. There's hardly another office in the world that is capable of doing that by office, quite apart from who is occupying the seat. And I think, therefore, we are all hoping and praying, because I think we've learnt from Barack Obama not to give the Nobel Prize before anything has really happened. We're all hoping and praying that there is going to be some building on the remarkable initiative of Pope John Paul II to assemble people in Assisi, because the world certainly needs that kind of convening and bringing of people together. And so I'm very hopeful, as you have indicated, but I am looking particularly for the use of the Petrine office to convene the world of faith in the way in which only the Pope can.
Thank you very much, Bishop Richard. Your last remarks made me think of what was said by a great work of Christian unity, Cardinal Sunens of Belgium. He said, if we are to unite, we must first love one another. And if we are to love one another, we must first get to know one another. Therefore, you are quite right. We need to be convened together. We need to look at each other, to look in other people's eyes and let them look into our eyes. But out of ecumenical friendships of this kind, a greater unity can surely come.
Amen.
So thank you for all that you've given us this evening. Plenty to think about. We are very grateful and honoured that you could come to address our fellowship.
It's been a treat. Thank you very much.